Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Tianlu, coming up in this edition. The 2024 summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation gets underway in Beijing, and Chinese President Xi Jinping has proposed elevating bilateral ties with all African countries that have diplomatic relations with China to the level of strategic relations. The UN Security Council again calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, with some members insisting on a firmer stance. And a 14-year-old suspect is in custody after allegedly killing 4 and injuring 9 in a high school shooting in the US state of Georgia. We begin in Asia. Chinese President Xi Jinping has proposed elevating bilateral ties with all African countries that have diplomatic relations with China to the level of strategic relations. He was speaking at the opening ceremony of the 2024 summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing. President Xi called for building an all-weather China-Africa community with a shared future in the new era. The summit brought together leaders from more than 50 African countries for discussions on development and cooperation. The meeting adopted 2 documents, including a declaration on jointly building an all-weather China-Africa community with a shared future in the new era and an action plan for FOCAC for the next 3 years. Qizhi reports.
More than 3,000 leaders, officials and business representatives from China and Africa gathered at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing on Thursday morning for the opening ceremony of the 2024 summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. President Xi Jinping hailed China-Africa ties as being at their best in history.
Thanks to nearly 70 years of tireless efforts from both sides, the China-Africa relationship is now at its best in history. With its future growth in mind, I propose that bilateral relations between China and all African countries having diplomatic ties with China be elevated to the level of strategic relations, and that the overall characterization of China-Africa relations be elevated to an all-weather China-Africa community with a shared future for the new era.
China has been Africa's largest trading partner for 15 consecutive years, and Africa is also China's second largest overseas contracting projects market. President Xi said the trust and friendship will be sustained with more cooperation.
China and Africa account for 1/3 of the world population. Without our modernization, there will be no global modernization. In the next 3 years, China will work with Africa to take the following 10 partnership actions for modernization, to deepen China-Africa cooperation and spearhead the Global South modernization.
The 10 partnership actions proposed by the Chinese leader cover mutual learning among civilizations, trade prosperity, industrial chain cooperation and connectivity. Collaboration in health, agriculture, grain development and security are also priorities. The Chinese president also emphasized that joint efforts to pursue the dream of modernization will have global significance.
China and Africa's joint pursuit of modernization will set off a wave of modernization in the Global South and open a new chapter in our drive for a community with a shared future for mankind.
The theme of this year's summit is joining hands to advance modernization and build a high-level China-Africa community with a shared future. Officials say this signifies China and Africa's vision and ambition to traverse the path towards modernization.
That was Qizhi reporting. On the Middle East, Hamas says there is no need for a new ceasefire proposal for Gaza, and Israel should be pressured to agree to the U.S. plan of July the 2nd. In New York, United Nations Security Council members have again called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Some countries insist the Council needs to take a firmer stance to end the fighting. Jody Jacobs reports.
It was another intense session of the UN Security Council. The meeting was requested by Israel after the bodies of 6 hostages killed in Gaza were recovered last weekend. There were calls, some heated, in the council chamber for an immediate ceasefire to end the suffering of the hostages being held by Hamas and the Palestinian people. Several countries stressed the importance of upholding international law, with Algeria's ambassador Amer Benyami saying that the council is at an inflection point and is faced with a test that will define the international world order and protect the multilateral system. China says it is imperative that the council redoubles its efforts to bring an end to the fighting. It says despite repeated international efforts and calls for a ceasefire, there is still no sign of easing or de-escalation.
This war has been raging for too long. Ceasefire negotiations have been delayed for too long, and the suffering of the population has persisted for too long. Time to put an end to it all. We support the Security Council taking further actions geared towards implementing the relevant Council resolutions, putting out the flames of war without delay, and alleviating its humanitarian fallout.
Wednesday's meeting took place against the backdrop of ongoing ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas, facilitated by Egypt, Qatar and the US.
We cannot lose patience with diplomacy. Diplomacy is not a matter of snapping our fingers and voila. It takes hard work. It takes effort. And unfortunately, it takes time. It has not failed.
The United Nations says a ceasefire is imperative. It remains convinced that peace will only be achieved when Israel and a sovereign Palestinian state live side by side within secure and recognized borders.
Now it's Jodie Jacobs at the UN. The United Nations says the first 3-day phase in the first round of polio vaccinations has reached 187,000 children under age 10 in Gaza's central zone. UN agencies hope to expand the campaign to harder hit areas in the north and south. They hope to vaccinate 640,000 children in total. Akram Asatari reports from Gaza.
Campaign is continuous. The statements that were made by the head of the WHO, World Health Organization, in Gaza were marking the end of stage 1, and we're marking also the transition to stage 2. They are moving to Khan Yunis and Rafah area. Of course, Rafah area is witnessing the large-scale ground operation that has been continuous for 3 months. So internally displaced people in Khan Yunis, from Rafah and Khan Yunis, will be taking their children to the different primary healthcare clinics for the sake of just accessing the vaccination, and the bombardment is still continuous.
That was Akram Al-Satari in Gaza. Turning to North America, police say a 14-year-old boy has killed 2 fellow students and 2 teachers in a shooting at a high school in the U.S. state of Georgia. 9 others were also wounded in the attack. This is the country's first mass campus shooting since the start of the school year. Jim Spellman has more from Washington.
The shooting happened at Appalachia High School in Winder, Georgia, on the outskirts of Atlanta. The investigation is still underway, but the Georgia Bureau of Investigations reports multiple deaths and injuries. We don't know if all the injuries are the result of gunfire, but a local hospital reports receiving at least 1 gunshot victim who is transported by helicopter. GBI also reports that 1 person is in custody.
Of those that are deceased, 2 were students and 2 were teachers here at the school. The priority right now for us within this investigation is to gather all the facts, to make sure that we're accurate with it, because this is a murder investigation.
My heart hurts for these kids. My heart hurts for our community. But I want to make it very clear that hate will not prevail in this county. I want that to be very clear and known. Love will prevail over what happened today.
The students were moved to the school's stadium to be reunited with parents. Other schools in the area were put on lockdown. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have been briefed on the situation. The White House will coordinate with federal, state, and local officials on the investigation. According to the nonprofit Everytown for Gun Safety, there have been at least 133 incidents of gunfire on school grounds in the U.S. in 2024, resulting in 38 deaths and dozens of injuries. And the sad political reality is that nothing is likely to be done anytime soon to really address gun violence in the U.S.
That was Jim Spellman on the latest school shooting in the U.S. Finally, in Europe, Russia has launched strikes on Lviv in western Ukraine, killing 7 people. It came a day after 2 Russian ballistic missiles hit the central town of Poltava, killing over 50. The latest attacks came as Ukraine's incursion into southern Russia enters its 5th week. Ukrainian troops have taken control of more territory in the Kursk region. Yolo Abdafid has more from the Russia-Ukraine border.
More dynamic and unpredictable for the past 18 months. One of the reasons for that is since July is the intensification, but definitely since August the 6th, when the Ukrainian army moved into the Kursk region, or a part of the Kursk region, inside southern Russia. This is the border crossing point that was demolished in the fighting. This is one of the roads that leads into the area, around 1,300 kilometers, which the Ukrainians control inside Russia. They've moved lots of soldiers in there, experienced soldiers from what we understand, and they've captured that area. They've also captured hundreds of prisoners, which they use to exchange for their own prisoners. But one thing that so far hasn't happened, it hasn't forced the Russians to move their own soldiers, experienced Russian fighters in the east of Ukraine, and move them here to try and kick the Ukrainians out. So far, that hasn't happened. But as a gamble, as a risk, it still remains to be seen how successful this daring incursion by the Ukrainians will be. The Commander-in-Chief, Alexander Shishk, says that this is an element where they are forcing the Russians to respond. So far, that Russian response, it could be argued, has been deadly. Deadly in terms of how many missiles have been fired towards Ukrainian cities, in Kyiv, for instance, and the deadly attack, 2 ballistic missiles in Poltava, with over 50 people killed and several hundred have been injured. What we don't know yet is how successful in the long term that this incursion into the Kursk region will be for the Ukrainians.
That was Yolo Abdafid on the latest in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Recapping today's headlines. The 2024 summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation gets underway in Beijing, and Chinese President Xi Jinping has proposed elevating bilateral ties with all African countries that have diplomatic relations with China to the level of strategic relations. The UN Security Council again calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, with some members insisting on a firmer stance. And a 14-year-old suspect is in custody after allegedly killing 4 and injuring 9 in a high school shooting in the US state of Georgia. That's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to The Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Tianlu. Thank you for listening.